This week saw a string of progressive victories from coast to coast, as well as some fascinating Republican primaries. Emily, let's start real quickly, if you don't mind, in Oregon, because there's some real kind of laughers out there for people who enjoy Schadenfreude. So we could start with Oregon's 5th district. So this was Kurt Schrader, who is the former chairman of the Blue Dog Caucus, one of the most conservative Democrats in the House. He cast the deciding vote in the Energy and Commerce Committee to kill drug pricing reform legislation. He was then criticized for how much money he has taken from pharma throughout his career and saying this looks like a payoff here. And he said, look, I'm not going to defund my campaign. That was his defense of taking all the pharma money, that if he did, it would defund his campaign. This super PAC called Center Forward, which is run by the pharmaceutical industry, came into his primary and spent more than $1 million to defend him. He also had the endorsement of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, despite killing their drug price legislation and also saying that he wanted to kill Build Back Better and actively working inside the House caucus to split the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better so that, and this was what he said, so that they could then focus on killing Build Back Better. So he outspent his progressive primary challenger roughly 10-1 if you count the outside money. And all the votes are not counted yet, but with 50% reporting, because Oregon is mail, and in the county where Schrader is does the best, they screwed up their ballots, and so they have to hand count them. But she's up by 21 points so far. And people in Oregon are saying that it's really unlikely that he can close this gap here. And I'll give you the Oregon 6th. If you remember, we talked about the crypto bros. There were not just one, but two crypto bros running in this 6th district. One was Carrick Flynn, who had more than $11 million spent on his behalf by $10 million from a super PAC, a crypto super PAC, crypto-backed super PAC, and the other from House Majority PAC, Pelosi's PAC. And then this other guy, Cody Reynolds, that we talked about, spent something like $3 million of his own crypto money running in the race. The guy that spent $3 million got 11% of the vote. The guy that spent $10 million got just 18% of the vote. And they both lost to Andrea Salinas, a progressive member of the state legislature, who thumped them. Like it wasn't even close, despite being massively outspent. So what is it about Oregon that, because in most states, you spend that amount of money, no matter what, like you can elect Attila Hun in a Democratic primary if you have $10 million. What did you make of Schrader getting the boot and also these crypto folks falling short?
Yeah, the Schrader race is a really interesting one, partially because of who seems to be beating him. And I get the district is, probably way more friendly to progressive messaging, but he's represented that district for a while. And so to come in with that message and to have what appears to be such a decisive victory is really interesting. And I think if you look at Kathy Barnett in Pennsylvania, this is a race we previewed last week, someone who until the very last days had virtually no outside support, did not spend a lot of money. It's true that she lost. We still don't know who won the Republican Senate primary there. It's a razor thin margin. It's headed for a recount. But Kathy Barnett came within, I think she was 25%, and they're locked in somewhere around 31%. And so I think it's true. This is part of a broader trend that money in politics is more powerful in certain situations and certain cases than in others, and that's a pretty obvious statement. But I think the power in the age of new media of money can way more easily be chipped away at by good candidates who have support that's not just financial, but who are actually able to either do really good grassroots work or really good sort of new media work, maybe a combination of both. I mean, AOC is probably a good example from that, from a pure political standpoint. But I think this is actually, these are good case studies in that broader trend.
And as the current count stands, you've got good old Dr. Oz at a little over 1,000 votes ahead of Dave McCormick, who is Dina Powell. Dina Powell was a Goldman Sachs executive who worked in Trump's White House. McCormick is Dina Powell's husband. That wasn't enough to get Trump's endorsement, and Trump has actually attacked him pretty aggressively toward the end, and really pulled out the stops for Dr. Oz. There was a moment when Barnett was surging, where I was wondering, is Trump going to do that thing where he like switches horses at the very end? And it's like, Oz is a loser, like he did with Mo Brooks, who actually is now surging, which is hilarious, and we can talk about that. So Oz looks, he's 1,000 up. We'll see what happens with the recount. The supporters of McCormick are now saying, make sure we count all the mail ballots, which is not something they were saying in Pennsylvania in 2020. Who do you think is Trump says that Dr. Oz is the only one that can beat John Fetterman, who easily won the primary from the hospital. That doesn't seem right to me. Like as from Fetterman's perspective, I'd be more worried about a McCormick. But what's your sense of how Republicans feel about this recount?
They are absolutely, the Trump sort of coalition here is absolutely convinced that Dr. Oz is the electable person, and that, again, Kathy Barnett is wildly unelectable, but both Oz and McCormick would be preferable to her, and Oz is a strong preference because Trump sees him as like a very media-friendly and in some ways kind of moderate, but just like for this moment, well-tailored. But it's interesting because one of Oz's vulnerabilities is his financial relationship with China, his business relationship with China. That's where I think two races that have been high profile, but for the wrong reasons. Like, I'm fascinated to see what happens between Oz and McCormick and Fetterman, and what happens in a similar way between J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan, because you're pitting these two sort of ideologically similar but opposed strains of populism on the left and the right against each other. And we'll see that from Oz and McCormick either way, but they're going to have a harder time, I think, making that pitch given their backgrounds than somebody like Fetterman would. And I think J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan, you're testing really similar things. And those are my two favorite races, because I'm going to be really curious to see how those messages are developed to compete against each other, how a J.D. Vance develops his message to compete against a Tim Ryan, and how a Tim Ryan develops his message to compete against a J.D. Vance. Does it make Tim Ryan seem more like a conservative populist? I don't know. The last thing I'll say is that I really think Fetterman is more vulnerable than a lot of people realize. And I would say that particularly because of the energy issue. And in a state like Pennsylvania, that's absolutely huge. And if you're going to the polls in Pennsylvania with super high gas prices in the fall, and with somebody who's more on the environmentalist side of that question, you're going to, I think, be very easily persuaded that your immediate financial interests at the pump are at stake in that question.
Although he's a savvy politician, and in 2020 he was warning Biden, don't go all in on a fracking ban. And the left, actually, that's one of their biggest frustrations with him. Is that he's been reluctant to be critical of fracking, I think, for the exact reasons that you're talking about. Do you want to talk next week's primaries now, or do you want to talk Mastriano, because that was a kind of fascinating win too in the Republican gubernatorial primary?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, the Republican establishment, there are certain races that they freak out about because they think somebody is unelectable in the general, and even if they're a better candidate, this happens in both parties every single cycle, but it's been sort of magnified in the Trump era. Although you could go back to Christine O'Donnell and say that this has been magnified in other parts of history. You could certainly go further back than that, actually, to Reagan even. But this was the Mastriano race is one that really had a lot of people in the Republican establishment very, very nervous. Do you have thoughts on that from your perspective on the left?
I mean, certainly the people who support Shapiro, who ran unopposed, he's Attorney General, he ran unopposed in the primary for governor, they are ecstatic. Now, Lou Barletta finished second, so I think they'd have been totally fine with him because he got annihilated 4 years ago. But they are very excited, I think, to be running against Mastriano. This is the Stop the Steal January 6th guy that they think that they can, they think that he scares enough people in the suburbs around Philadelphia, basically, and around Pittsburgh that Shapiro's now going to cruise. In fact, Shapiro spent a significant amount of money in the primary boosting Mastriano, like running ads saying this guy's too conservative, Trump loves him too much, he tried to overthrow the government. You don't want him as your nominee in the Republican Party, do you? I'm Josh Shapiro and I hate Mastriano. And then all the voters are like, all the Republican voters are like, okay, then yes, we love this guy. And Shapiro's like, excellent.
Well, and we talked to Nina Turner about how the opposite had happened in her race, with the parties sort of flipped. And this happened, I think it happened in one of the Oregon races as well. And yeah, it's crazy. But Mastriano is, if you flip exactly what the dynamic you just said, that who does he scare enough people in the suburbs, and apply it to Fetterman? How is Fetterman going to talk about all of these issues in a way that doesn't scare people off in the suburbs? But does it scare them off more than a Dr. Oz or a McCormick? These are just like who are going to be tied to Mastriano. That's where you can see that both parties are like really going to have to refine those messages and to play to those voters in a state like Ohio and a state like Pennsylvania in particular. And that's why I think these two states' races are so fascinating this cycle.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how it plays out, because Fetterman has a lot of the same kind of cultural politics that haven't been working lately for Democrats, but he scans differently culturally. And so if it's a culture question that you're voting on, you might just go on your cultural impression of who and what he is, and not even hear that he's saying kind of the same thing that some of the Democrats that you don't like are saying. And if that moves 10% of the vote of these marginal folks, then that's enough. And so it raises the question of whether if Democrats can just kind of look different and act different and like show that they're talking to people and meeting them at their level, that even if you disagree with them on some of the questions, you're still willing to then hear them out.
Right, and we've talked about this in the context of Randy Bryce before, but like Jason Kander has been making this pitch for years, just saying that like you can actually be progressive down the line, as somebody like Fetterman is, and if you can talk to people and meet them sort of where they are and just be a normal human being instead of like a progressive bot, you can win people with that sort of sense of authenticity. And I actually think Kander in himself is a good case study in that, and I think I could see that replicated by Fetterman. But I still think in this economy, that pitch is so much more difficult. It is so much more difficult in a state like Pennsylvania. And even if he's sort of been reluctant on fracking, totally right, because he knows, that you have to be a little bit more savvy in those cases. Having a green energy sort of reputation and history is going to be, it makes the job of Pennsylvania Republicans easier in the sort of Biden economy. Right. And that's why, again, this is just a really, really interesting race. It's shaping up to be a really interesting race.
Right. The environment might be so bad that he's just swamped by the partisan lean against Democrats. Right. There's nothing he can do about it. Then really quickly, Summer Lee, of course, wins in Pittsburgh despite $3 million of AIPAC and DMFI spending against her. There's a lot of momentum now going into Texas, where there are like 3 different progressives running in runoffs. The biggest one to watch will be Jessica Cisneros versus Henry Cuellar. Cuellar being the last kind of abortion rights opponent in the House, and also had his house raided by the FBI as part of an investigation into corruption. His allies are accusing her of being a homewrecker with a giant billboard. It's getting awfully ugly in that race, but we'll see how that one goes. But anyway, we have to leave it there. But don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while you're on the go, we're also available anywhere you listen to podcasts. That's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all those different places. So check that out. Emily, enjoy the rest of your work retreat. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful time.
I'm looking forward to being back in the studio next week because it's the most fun way to do this, Ryan.
Yes, no doubt. Yeah. Looking forward to having you back here. See you then.
See ya.